Hello everyone. In this video we're discussing HTML tables. And tables are actually one of the more simpler concepts that we discuss. So we're actually not going to spend a whole ton of time talking about tables here. I'd rather you spend more time actually working on just playing with tables yourself, exploring tables in your lab and assignment as you're working on things this week. So this is actually one of the more simple concepts that we do, but it is one of the more important concepts that we face because tables do have a very valid and a very important place in HTML. So I guess the place to start would be with what is that very valid, very important place. So tables. So the HTML table allows web designers to arrange and organize data. So when we talk about data, we're talking about text, we're talking about images, hyperlinks, forms, form fields, even other tables. Essentially any kind of markup code that we can think of, we can put in a table and we can use to organize inside of a table. And tables are a lot like Excel spreadsheets that you see. We have columns and rows that provide us the ability to kind of display our information. Our rows are displayed horizontally, and our columns go vertically. And so essentially what we end up with is this grid that we can use to organize and arrange information. Now, what makes a table different from a spreadsheet is, a spreadsheet is for the express purpose of calculation, for math. Tables are just for displaying data, making data easy to read. And oftentimes, when you get onto websites, that's something that you might have to do on occasion, because it is a purpose of the web is to display data to users. So if you have a bunch of data that you have to display to your end users, then the best way to organize that data is via a table. And the semantics that we have with our table element also provides accessible options via the screen reader and other accessible alternate navigation methods so that users with disabilities can navigate tables in a certain way that makes the information easier to get. But this wasn't always the sole purpose of tables. It is the sole purpose of tables now. But back in the day, right? Back in the early days of HTML, back when there was no CSS, we used tables to lay out data. To basically create a design on our websites instead of just displaying data in an organized fashion. Now, thanks to CSS, we don't have to do this anymore because actually this causes a whole bunch of problems for the aforementioned user with accessibility issues. When a user is using some kind of alternate means of access for interfacing with a website, that screen reader or something of that nature is going to interact with a table in a certain way. And that table is sort of going to force a certain navigation because, when the screen reader reads that, it's seeing the semantic elements for a table, and it's going to understand that that is a table, and it's going to try to insert the data that's in it and create that as some sort of higher organized data chart. But if the designer just meant it for decorative purposes and was just using it to lay out elements on a page, then the semantics that come along with the table are sort of shot here. So we don't really want to we don't really want to do that. We want to use CSS for laying out our elements and tables for laying out data in an organized manner. So we have these basic table elements, and these are our basic required table elements that we need just to create a table. There's some other stuff that we want to create a table. But these are the basic things that we need. One is our table tags. So we have our opening and closing paired table tags, and this defines the beginning and end of a table. So everything that we want inside of our table, all of our rows, all of our cells, all of our data, goes in between this opening and closing table tag. And in that sort of way, our table tag is sort of the container for all of that sort of information. Then we have our table rows. And this defines the beginning and end of the horizontal row. So the TR tag is our table row tag for our rows. Now, we don't have a column tag in HTML. There's no such thing as a column tag. Instead, we define things cell by cell. So we kind of create de facto columns based on the cells that we put into our table rows. So we have TD tags, which kind of seem a little strange based on what we're used to. The majority of the tags that we kind of encounter make a lot of sense in context. We have table for table, TR for table row, and then table cell is TD. That's sort of odd. But TD stands for table data or tabular data. So that's where we actually put the data that goes into the cell or that makes up the cell. So cells are always placed inside of a row. So what we see here is we kind of see a big nested sort of structure here in terms of our DOM, right? We see a table container, and inside of that table container, we might have several row containers. And inside of those row containers, we might have several cells. Just as many as we want to define. And that makes up sort of the hierarchy, the DOM structure of our table. And so when you're thinking about how we kind of place our elements in that sort of way, we can think about it in that sort of structure. So when we put it into context, we can look at our code. And so this is a basic table components code example. So you can see here that we have our table tags representing the big part of our structure. We have our table row tags. And we have a couple sets of table data or cell tags that are outlining our information. So from here, as we like to do a lot of times, I'd like to jump over to a code pen and just do a bit of a live demonstration here in developing this table. So what I've got here is just an empty code pen. You can see I've kind of restructured my code pen just a little bit from the default. I've made my HTML window just a little bit wider because sometimes our table rows can get a little wide. So in doing so, we kind of want a little bit more room to work. So I just kind of made this a little wider. And what we're going to make in this demonstration is just kind of a little class schedule table. So I'm going to start off by adding my table tags. And we'll zoom in so you all can see this just a little bit better. So we'll add our table tag, and we'll go ahead and add our closing table tag so we don't forget it. And then we're going to go ahead and add our table row tags with the accompanying closing table row tag. And we're going to ultimately have 5 rows, but for the time being, we're going to have 4 rows. So we're just going to go ahead and copy and paste that in there. And in each row, we're going to have a time for the course. We're going to have the days the course meets on, or where the course meets. And we're going to have the title of the course. So the first course is going to meet from 8:30 a.m. to 11 o'clock a.m. And we want to put that in between TD tags. And then between our next set of TD tags, we'll go ahead and add our TD tags. The course is going to meet on Monday and Wednesday. And finally, in our last cell, our last set of TD tags, the class is going to be biology. And then for the sake of time here, I'm just going to take all of the interior structure here, copy it, and paste it on the inside of the rest of my rows. And then we're just going to go in and switch up the text a little bit. So the next course will be from 2 o'clock p.m. to 4 o'clock p.m. And it's going to meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And it's going to be college algebra. And then for the sake of time, I think these last couple of classes, they can be online classes. So let's make them both online. And their meeting days will be online. And this one will be Intro to Networking. And this one will be Java Programming. And there we go. And we can see we have a basic kind of table structure here. And one thing that's a dead giveaway that we have a table structure is our white space here, where we have this little white space where this line is shorter than the line above it between the next part of the next cell here. That's a dead giveaway that our table kind of worked before we do our CSS formatting. But those aren't the only elements that we can put in a table. We can do more with a table. Like, one of the things that you might find kind of strange here is that, well, this is a cool table, but how do I know what these columns or what these rows represent? Well, we have an element for that. And we have some other things that we can talk about here. So let's look at some other table components. One is a TH table component. And this defines a table header row. And we use this instead of TD. So by default, this gives our text a little bit of special formatting. So the text is bold and it's centered within the cell. It also specifies what is going on in that particular column or that particular row. So it kind of defines the type of information that's being presented in a particular column or a particular row. And you can define it to start at the top of a column or at the top of a row based on where you use the TH tags and by using the scope attribute. So if I want to define my row as my header, then the first cell in my row I define as THs, and I use a scope of row. And then that element would define all of the information that is in that particular row. If I want to use a column for headers, I can create an entire row of nothing but TH elements, and then I can define a scope of col, C-O-L, on each of those elements, which is what we're going to do in our example here in just a moment. And then that would set the information type for all of the elements that fall in the column below. We also have the caption element, and the caption element is an optional element. It sets a caption for the table, so it goes inside of the table tag, but outside of all the rows and cells and all that kind of fun stuff. So you should only have one caption per table, and it appears centered to the table. And this can kind of be like your title of the table. So let's kind of look at all of these elements here. So we have we've added a caption into our table here. We've called it just fun table, and it just goes in between a couple of caption tags. And you can see these table heading tags here. The table heading tags just go in the place of TD or table data tags. And we've defined our scope element for a column in these tags. So let's head back to our code pen and let's put a caption and a table heading row into these. So let's zoom back in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by making a caption here. Caption, and this is just going to call, we're just going to call this class schedule. And you can see by default, without doing any other editing here, that class schedule is centered on that table. So that's pretty cool. And then we can create a new table row to contain our table headers. So that's going to be TH with a scope attribute equal to col. Or we're going to call this one class time. And we'll close the TH. A TH with a scope attribute with the value of col. Meeting days. And a TH with the scope attribute with the value of col. And class name. Close that TH. Close that TR. And so you can see in relation to the rest of the table, our table headings are bold and they're centered in relation to their column. And so that's how we add a heading, and that's how we add a caption to our table. But by and large, our table still pretty ugly, right? Plain, boring. So let's talk about styling tables. We can style tables and we can improve the look of the tables greatly with CSS. So we want to use a lot of CSS. And for the most part, a lot of the CSS you already know is going to apply to the CSS for tables. So let's just work through how we can style tables via our example, and then we'll come back and look at something kind of specific. So let's start off, and I'm just going to kind of stay zoomed out for this one just so we can get a big picture here. Let's start out by taking our asterisk selector and setting the font family of everything for sans serif. And I'm going to put a padding of, I believe, 12 pixels on everything. So we're just going to go ahead and make everything nice, just right up front. Now on my table, I'm going to change the width. You could use a static width. I'm going to use a dynamic width of 80%. You could also use a static width of like 960 pixels or whatever you'd like to use there. And I'm going to add a border, and I'm going to add a different border to the table than I am to the table rows. So you can add different borders to each element of your table, your TR, and your TH and your TD, to change the borders and make them all look different. So I'm going to add a border here for my table. And it's just going, so in doing so, it's just going to put a nice border around the outside of my entire table. So I'm going to give it a border of 5 pixels, solid, and I'm going to give it the color of 525252. And so that just puts a nice border around the entire outside of the table. So in doing that now, I want to add some borders around each of my rows. I'm going to go back and do a little something else to my rows in just a little bit. But I want to add a little bit of a border here to just create a little bit of a demarcation between all of them. So I'm going to add a border of 2 pixels, solid, and AAA. On all of my rows. Now you can kind of see here that there's nothing showing up, and that's kind of odd. Right? And what we need to do is we need to define our border collapse property, and that's something that's kind of unique to our table. So we need to get into our table and define our border collapse. So that's our border collapse property. And we're going to define it to collapse. And in doing so, once we define that border collapse property, now those table row borders show right up the way that we wanted them to. So border collapse is something that we can do to kind of make the borders in our tables a little bit interesting. I'm going to add a little bit of other CSS here. Like I'm going to head over to our table header row. I'm going to put a background color on that. So that's background color. We'll make it like an orange. And we'll change the text color to white. And I'll make the font size just a little bit bigger. We'll use 18 pixels this time. I also might like to change our caption. Maybe I might want to make that a little bigger. So we'll change the font size there to maybe 24 pixels and make the font weight bolder to get a nice bold caption there. And so by and large, this, looks pretty good. We got a pretty good looking table now. We started with a really boring, plain looking table, and now we actually have a pretty decent looking table here. But there's one thing that's kind of common with tables that you might want to do with the table, and it's kind of an important little CSS rule, a CSS selector here that we can utilize. Because you might have seen tables before that have like every other row with a different background color. And that kind of makes it a little more readable, makes each row kind of stand out. And we can actually use the nth of type CSS selector for this purpose. So one of the interesting things that you might want to do with tables is do that selective highlighting on alternate rows for readability. So we can use nth of type for this. And nth of type doesn't just work with this. It works with pretty much every element on your page. If you have multiple elements of a single type, essentially what the nth of type selector does is it matches every element that is the nth child or some number child of a particular type of its parent. So if we don't define a parent, it's talking about, just in the body of the document. So you can do this with really any type of HTML element if you want to do some special formatting for specific elements of a certain type. So I'm going to do that in our table here and on our table rows. And I'm going to zoom into this one so you can see it a little better. We're going to add our nth of type selector. And in between the parentheses here, we put the type. Now, we have our tables here. That's a row, that's a row. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I want every even one to have a different background color. So I'm going to say nth of type even and do a different background color on all of them. Background color. We'll say CCC, CCC. So now you can see in doing that. And if we kept on adding rows, it would keep on doing every even numbered row and having the background color be that light gray. So in doing so, that kind of gives us that selective highlighting and, highlights alternated rows and gives us a little bit better readability here. So as you can see, tables are pretty easy. We use these tables, just to display data, so we don't really have to go too deep into them. So I hope I've shown you some good ways to start in working with tables on your own, and I'm encouraging you as you pursue working with tables this week in your assignments that you play with them and explore working with tables in a grand fashion to try to get them to do what you want them to do, because a really nice looking table can go a long way in making a website really look like something nice. And having data well organized and well presented in a nice looking table can be exceptionally important. So that's all that I have for you for this particular video. Thank you for watching.